Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Chrome, also known as Advanced Battlegrounds: The Future of Combat for PC. This review is coming to you courtesy of Lord Chaos. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter developed by Techland, originally published by Strategy First back in 2003. And it's kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. The most notable of these being that it's one of the first major worldwide releases that came out of Poland. Techland is a Polish company, and by now everybody knows them for the Call of Juarez series, as well as Dead Island and Dying Light, but this was basically their first foray into the international market, and it didn't have a particularly great reception, didn't have a particularly bad one either, and the original version of the Chrome engine was on display here, which is really the other thing that's interesting about it. It has rather large open environments for you to run around in that is something that wasn't really in FPSs of the time, and it allows for more creative and tactical freedom than pretty much every other FPS on the market at the time. So the question here becomes, how well did they use that, and more importantly, how is the first major release that we saw from Poland? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's okay for its time. The wide open environments thing is really noteworthy about the game because it does limit the amount of things you can do with the actual visuals. And what they managed to do with those is pretty decent for the most part. You've got some pretty solid modeling for the most part. You've got some decent texture work here and there. The one thing that really kills it though is the animations, because at least in the first person the animations are downright terrible, where they're just sluggish and awkward looking and they just don't have any oomph to them. Whereas in third person they generally look okay, they're serviceable, and that's kinda it. So the visuals aren't particularly impressive, but that wide open environments thing is what really had people going for it at the time. And then there's the sound design, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have John St. John doing the voice acting for the main character, Logan, and he turns in a pretty good performance. Unfortunately, he is the only one who puts out a decent performance, as everyone else in the game put out a pretty terrible performance. The voice acting apart from John St. John's stuff is just downright awful, and rather unpleasant to listen to. And then there's the sound effects, which are not particularly impressive, and a lot of them actually sound downright wimpy. And then of course there's the music, which is nothing to write home about. It's serviceable at best, and that's about all you can say for it. So overall, the only thing that really stands out in terms of the presentation is, of course, the wide open environments that this thing has. And everything else either suffers or just is average at best, really. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Bolt Logan, who is a mercenary, and at the very beginning of the game he is betrayed by his partner Pointer and basically framed for stealing blueprints that he was sent to retrieve. And from there he ends up finding a woman named Carrie, who becomes his new partner after the time skip, and they end up going on some missions, find out that there's this big conspiracy with this resource that's the most valuable in the universe, basically unobtainium, only they call it Chrome. And the idea there is that there's this corporate conspiracy with regards to this large deposit of Chrome being on this planet, and it basically loses you very, very quickly. Unfortunately for the game, it doesn't really have any compelling characters to bring you through or any sort of mystery that you actually give a crap about. It really does just drag on and on and on. And by the time you finally get to the end game and there's an actual decision to be made that will determine your ending, there's 3 different endings depending on who you choose to side with at the end of the game. Of course, it's basically an arbitrary choice at the end of the game. But suffice to say, by that point, you don't care anymore, so you're just going to pick whatever the hell you feel like, and you're probably never going to go back and find out what the other endings are. Even then, none of the endings are particularly great, so the plot just leaves you disappointed. Because let's face it, it could have gone somewhere, but they just weren't up to the task. So what about the gameplay? Well, this is where things get kind of interesting. As I've mentioned before, there are large open environments for you to run around in. It is a first-person shooter, so you're basically doing what you would expect from that, which is run around, shoot stuff, maybe flip a switch or two, complete your objectives, move on to the next objective, that sort of thing. But they changed some things up here and there. For example, they have an inventory system, which is based on blocks in your inventory. So you're pretty limited in what you can actually carry around and use. So you have to keep in mind what you want to use for any given mission and just take it along. You don't really have much in the way of loadouts, you just kind of have to deal with whatever the game gives you, and you roll with it from there. Unfortunately for the game, the weapons are very uninspired and outright boring to use half the time. It's stuff you've seen in every other FPS ever. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, submachine guns. The standard fare that you're used to. And none of it is particularly satisfying to use. A lot of it just lacks oomph. You can waste entire magazines on single enemies before they finally go down. And that just gets annoying. It also doesn't help that the way you actually aim is not through any sort of sights or scopes or anything like that, unless it's just a weapon that has a scope. It's that ridiculous zoom mechanic. And if you zoom, then the weapon takes up a huge portion of the screen and just gets in your way. So that doesn't help, on top of the weapon accuracy being fairly low. As in, if you fire more than a couple of shots, you're not going to be hitting what you're aiming at. Now you can improve your accuracy somewhat by using the augments that the game gives you, where it just lets you have some sort of superhuman abilities, one of which being that you move faster, which is incredibly useful, because most of the time you're just kind of running around. You're not actually in vehicles, which can be problematic because the environments are so big. So it takes you a long time to move anywhere. And that becomes very tiring. Because let's face it, there's these long segments of downtime where nothing is happening and you're just moving from one place to another. And when you finally get to the next place, there's where the enemies are going to show up and actually be in your way, so you can actually do some things other than just walk from place to place. And as you use your augments, they become more and more problematic. You see, as you use your implants, this meter builds up where it's more and more strain on your body, and once it fills up, you take damage. And so that adds another level of annoyance to the game where you're constantly having to deactivate your implants, otherwise they'll overload and you'll take damage, and so you can't really let loose with those and be the superhuman fighter that you want to be. And even worse is when you're in those really large environments and you don't have access to vehicles, and so you just kind of run around and use your augment to make you move faster. And of course that particular implant makes your meter fill up incredibly quickly, which becomes problematic. Are you seeing my problem here? The game becomes an exercise in resource management more than an actual FPS. The actual shooting stuff takes up a fairly small portion of the game. Most of the time, you're just kind of running around, picking up items in your inventory that are useful to you, like ammunition, or weapons, or health packs. Or you're just paying attention to your strain meter because you don't want to overload and take damage when you have a very limited number of health packs available. So, more often than not, you find yourself not able to just let loose and have fun. Now, it's one thing to have this sort of tactical approach, where you really do have to take stock of what you have and how you can use that, how you can use the environment to your advantage, how you can use the enemy AI to your advantage, that sort of thing. But what might be construed as tactical actually ends up being a detriment in this particular game, because it doesn't play out like a tactical FPS. It plays out more like a standard FPS, just with some elements thrown in there to make it a bit different. And none of this is helped by the incredibly poor enemy AI, where sometimes they will just not notice you even though you've shot the guy right next to them. Sometimes they will spot you from a mile away and just snipe you with pinpoint accuracy with a pistol and just basically insta-gib you. It's ridiculous. And so you find that the AI becomes incredibly annoying, and the game just ends up being infuriating as a result. This isn't a fun FPS. And even if you take it as a tactical FPS, it's not enjoyable in that regard, and it actually makes things worse. Because again, it doesn't play like a tactical FPS, it plays like a pretty standard FPS, with a few elements that might be construed as tactical thrown in there. So what is Chrome? It's an interesting idea, where you have these large open environments with this kind of conspiracy plotline, and some mechanics that might be better if they were fleshed out more. But ultimately, this is just an incredibly forgettable FPS. It's not terrible, I've certainly played worse games than this, but by and large, everything in here is either average or mediocre. And considering what it is, it feels more like a tech demo than a proper game, which is kind of a shame. because there's another game that's fairly similar to this that came out a lot later, and despite not being a good game, it got a lot of praise, and that game was called Crysis. So oddly enough, in retrospect, this thing almost feels like a prototype of some ideas that would be explored in Crysis. At least Crysis had some better FPS mechanics, but this thing just feels like a mediocre FPS in general that had some cool ideas, but never really went anywhere with them. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.